How's it going? Welcome to the very first episode of Mood for Feud. Woo! Thank you so much for being here. Some of you may know that I have literally been trying to put this podcast together this entire year. It was my goal to launch it in 2023, and obviously, in classic Cartier fashion, I had to wait till there was only 1 month left before I managed to get my shit together. But here we are, and here you are. Thank you so much for being here. You're officially one of those people who's cool, hip, trend-setting. You know about stuff before it blows up. You hear a popular song on the radio and you're like, I remember listening to this on SoundCloud. TikTok will discover some random new artist and you'll be like, I've been following them since they were 12 years old. I knew Imagine Dragons when there was still a girl in the band. I did actually know Imagine Dragons when there was still a girl in the band. Anyway, I want to get straight into it. In this episode, we're covering two bitchin' broads, Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. A little disclaimer, I was sick when I recorded this episode. So if my voice sounds a little bit scratchy or you're like, ugh, she is sniffling all the time, don't worry. It should only be for this one because I was sick. I have been healthy for the other ones that I have recorded. However, before we get into the feud, I do want to give a little intro into why I decided to start podcasting. Lord knows we already have enough podcasts. I am really saturating an already saturated market, but I just want to give you a little bit into why I'm deciding to do this anyway. If you literally don't care about that and you just want to get straight to the content, that is absolutely fine. I have got some timestamps in the show notes so you can skip ahead to the content or to the bits that you're interested in, and that saves you the effort of having to leave me a 1-star review and be like, the intro is so long, because there you go, you can skip right ahead. For the rest of you who are still here, I just wanted to give a little background into why I decided to start doing this. So yeah, if you know me, you know I am pop culture obsessed, and even though pop culture can be labeled as being a bit shallow or, a bit of a surface level interest or hobby, I actually think it is more deep than it presents itself to be, because pop culture in reality influences consumerism, it impacts marketing and fashion, it can influence our interests and change the way that we speak online. Yeah, so even though it's this kind of vapid thing, it's got quite tangible outcomes in society, and that's what really draws me into it. I listen to a lot of other pop culture podcast creators, and I love the way that they deep dive into different aspects of pop culture, and they come at it with a critical lens to kind of untangle some of those greater forces that are at play. And I am in such awe of what they do, and I also really wanted to contribute to that space and bring my own thoughts to the conversation. And that's basically why we're here. At the same time, I have all this pop culture knowledge in my brain, and I literally have nowhere to put it or nothing to do with it. And so at the very least, this is just a nice little passion project for me to put those thoughts somewhere, even if it is into the void a little. So yeah, it's a passion project. So Mood for Feud is going to deep dive into some of my favorite feuds in pop culture. And I love drama, I love scandal, I love gossip. And feuds really have all of those things. So it was a natural topic for me to land on. I am literally that person where if you're telling me about some fight between two of your coworkers, and even if I have no idea who they are and I will never meet them, I will still be so invested because I'm literally just so nosy. And luckily for me, celebrities air their shit out all the time. So I don't even have to go digging that hard to find it. Yeah, that's how I landed here. If you've got any feuds in particular that stand out to you and you'd like me to cover, please let me know. I am on Instagram at Mood for Feud. Follow along. I do post, some photos or videos that I talk about in episodes there, so definitely check that out. That's enough from me. Let's get into the first episode. I hope you enjoy it. Yeah, I hope you learn something new. Let me know what you think, and God, I don't really know what else to say. Have fun listening. So Bette Davis and Joan Crawford are two iconic actresses that were part of the glamorous old Hollywood. I don't remember the first time I heard who Joan Crawford was, but I do really distinctly remember the first time I looked up Bette Davis, and that's because my mum would always listen to that song that's like, she's got Bette Davis eyes, and I just was so intrigued by that. Like, who is Bette Davis? What do her eyes look like? Why are they so interesting that this lady wrote a whole song about it? So I googled her, and I have to say she does have incredible eyes. They are just absolutely piercing. So I get the hype. I think I've seen one of Bette Davis's movies as well. I think I watched Jezebel at some stage in uni. Probably part of my film degree, and yeah, she's a great actress. I haven't actually seen any of Joan Crawford's work, but I do really want to go watch some of her movies after this. I do actually really enjoy watching old Hollywood movies. So even though these two women have one of the most long-lived feuds in history that is still being talked about in 2023, I actually found when I was researching them that they also shared a lot of similarities. I'm going to give you a bit of a background into each of these women, and let me know what you think. When I was researching them, I actually was really shocked at just how many uncanny things they had in common. So let's start with Joan Crawford. It's actually a little unclear as to what year she was born. So her tombstone stated 1908. In her daughter's memoir, she wrote 1904. And when Joan registered at a college in Missouri, she wrote 1906 as her birth date. So it's a little unclear, but let's just say she was born somewhere between 1904 and 1908. She was born in Texas under the name Lucille Fay LeSueur, and she is an Aries. So her dad was not in the picture, and she was actually raised by her stepfather, who operated an opera house and a theatre, and Joan would often accompany him to work, and this is where she really got her passion for the performing arts. And so when she was older, she decided that she wanted to be a dancer, and she actually joined a traveling dance troupe. Now, while she was performing with this dance troupe in New York City, an MGM talent scout actually discovered her. MGM, of course, being the major movie network, Metro-Goldwyn and Mayer. And Hollywood did operate a little differently back then, so it was largely dominated by the studio systems. And basically what that meant is that a studio like MGM, for example, would hire these actors and actresses under contracts, and while you were under that contract, you would basically only make movies with that one studio. And they would do the same. They'd have contracts for writers and directors. So the studios actually largely ran the film industry. It's not like it is today where you'll see actors make films for multiple different studios. So after she was discovered by the talent scout in New York City, in 1925, Joan Crawford moved to Hollywood, and this is also when she changed her name from Lucille to Joan Crawford as her stage name. I'm not sure why she did that. There's some sources that say she wanted like a more American sounding name. I'm not sure how true that is. I think Lucille Fay LeSueur is actually a really stunning name. If I were her, I would have probably kept it, but I guess it's a different time, and Joan Crawford does sound a bit more American. So 1925 she moves to Hollywood, and by the 1930s she's actually in one of the top 10 money-making stars. So her career's going incredibly well, and she's making a lot of movies. Joan Crawford was known for playing characters that had a rags to riches kind of storyline, and I think this suits Joan well because I don't think she grew up super poor necessarily, but she definitely didn't grow up as like a Nepo baby or something like that. So she started in a dance troupe and she was kind of scouted, which I just think that's such a cool story for coming into Hollywood. I think that's like every little girl's dream who wants to be a performer, that you'll just be like walking through the supermarket singing, and this man will come and tap you on the shoulder and be like, I'm a scout for Disney Channel and we need you to be in Wizards of Waverly Place right now. Anyway, so yeah, 1930s, Joan's doing really well, but by the 1940s her films actually stopped making money. And this is around the same time that she adopts her first child, Christina, and later she would also adopt a boy named Christopher. In 1943, Joan terminates her contract with MGM and joins Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers is the studio where Bette Davis was working. In 1945, Joan Crawford was cast in Mildred Pierce, but she actually clashed with the director Michael Curtis, who originally wanted to cast Bette Davis in the role. However, when Bette Davis turned down the role, the studio decided that Joan Crawford should get the title role of Mildred Pierce, and Michael Curtis was not happy about that. He was quoted as saying, "Why should I waste my time directing a has-been?" And he had a really weird issue with Joan's shoulder pads. So Michael alleged that Joan was always wearing shoulder pads underneath all of her costumes, and so he actually burst into one of her costume fittings and tore off the front of her dress to try expose her shoulder pads, which is just insane. And stories like this do kind of remind me that even though it sometimes feels like we haven't come that far in Hollywood in terms of how women are treated, I would like to think that if a director burst into someone's costume room and just tore off the top of their dress, they would probably get cancelled and hopefully be at least removed from the project. They probably would continue to work, but they'd at least get removed, some kind of repercussion. But at the time, this wasn't really anything unusual, and Joan was just quoted saying she was really thankful that she was wearing a bra that day. Which honestly just breaks my heart a little bit. So yeah, he doesn't sound like the best guy. Either way, Joan Crawford stuck it out. She made the movie. And in 1945, she actually won an Oscar for Best Actress. So, I don't know. What can we learn? Probably that even if you've got a really shitty boss or something, if you stick it out, you might get an Oscar. You decide if that's worth a form of sexual harassment. In 1947, Joan Crawford adopted twins Kathy and Cynthia, and she actually ended up leaving most of her fortune to these twins. She had a very rocky relationship with her eldest, her first adopted child, Christina. In her lifetime, Joan was married 4 times. 3 ended in divorce, and the last ended when her husband died. Her last husband was actually a Pepsi ambassador, and his name was Alfred Steele. And upon his death, Joan was elected onto the board of directors, so she kind of took over his role at Pepsi, which is pretty cool. Now, onto Bette Davis. She was born in 1908, so similar age to one of the years that Joan Crawford could potentially have been born in. She is also an Aries, and for any astrology girlies listening, you'll know that 2 Aries in competing industries are probably not going to get along. So I feel like this feud was just a canon event. It just had to happen. Bette Davis was born Ruth Elizabeth Davis, but grew up being called Betty. Her father left when she was 10, so she also didn't grow up with her dad in the house, but she was largely pretty much raised by her mother, Ruthie. And Ruthie saved all her money to make sure she could send her girls to private school. Go moms. After finishing school, Bette Davis attended a drama school, and by age 22, she moved to Hollywood to screen test for Universal Studios. She actually had a really rough start with them. The studio was not her biggest fan, and they wanted to terminate her employment completely, but one of their directors really liked her eyes. Those Bette Davis eyes coming to save her. This is why she gets a whole song about them. So his name was Carl Freund, and so she managed to spend a year at Universal Studios before they then decided to not renew her contract. So after her contract wasn't renewed with Universal Studios, Bette Davis kind of felt like maybe her acting career was over and she was getting ready to move back home. But George Arliss, an actor who worked for Warner Brothers at the time, actually handpicked Bette Davis to co-star alongside him in a movie, and this gave her head start. This gave her her main start. Bette Davis actually was quoted saying that it was George Arliss who single-handedly saved her career, because if it weren't for him, she would have gone home and would have stopped acting. Bette Davis was mostly known for playing unsympathetic and cynical characters who were often confrontational, had some gusto, and she had a really intense acting style, fiercely independent. And even in Jezebel, which I've only seen one movie of hers, but in Jezebel you can so see that energy coming through. Like, she just seems like a really brazen, confident, unapologetic woman. So after starting at Warner Brothers, she starred in the film Dangerous, and she eventually won the Oscar for that. She didn't think she would win, so she actually wasn't going to go to the Oscars. However, Jack Warner, who was one of the studio heads, pretty much told her she had to attend. So to kind of spite him, she wore this kind of costumey, old looking navy dress. And by navy, I mean on the boats navy, not the shade of blue. So she wears this old navy dress to kind of spite him and look ugly. And she does end up winning. So she goes up in her little navy dress and accepts her Oscar, which is, I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. I think a lot of people take the Oscars super seriously, and I'm not saying that she didn't, but I think it's kind of iconic that she went up there not in her best dress to accept the award. So I'll try to find a photo of that for the Instagram. Now, some sources claim that she is the first actress for Warner Brothers to win a Best Actress Oscar. I'm not entirely sure how true that is. I did try to do some digging, but I wasn't able to find any concrete information. Now, Bette Davis also claims that she is the reason why we now call the Oscar Awards Oscar. And call me stupid, but I always thought Oscar stood for something. Like, I always thought it was like outstanding screen, something, acting, something. But turns out it's actually just called the Academy Award, and Oscar is like a nickname for it. And Bette Davis claims that when she saw the statue, the like butt of it reminded her of her then husband's butt, and his middle name is Oscar, and so she started calling the statue Oscar because she thought the butt looked like her husband's butt, which I think is pretty funny. I have read a couple of conflicting stories from people who think that they are actually the ones who first called the Oscar, but they weren't like half as entertaining as her version. So if I had to pick a reality, I'd say yes, 100% we call the Oscars because Bette Davis's husband's butt resembled the butt of this Oscar. Bette Davis stayed at Warner Brothers for 18 years. It was a bit of a rocky relationship. There were many times where she was mad at the studios, either because of the roles they gave her or because she wasn't happy with her co-stars, etc. There was actually one time where she broke her contract's rules and left for England and made 2 movies in England, which the studio was not at all happy about. They actually went to court over it, and the court case was held in England, and unfortunately Bette Davis did lose. I think the main consensus from the people at the court trial was that Bette Davis was kind of labelled as this brat who should just be grateful to be working in Hollywood and just accept the parts that get given to her. And it's funny because I think we still see a similar narrative today. For example, when Jennifer Lawrence spoke out about not getting paid the same as her co-stars in that Don't Look Up movie with Leo DiCaprio, and people were like, oh, but she's making millions of dollars per movie. Like, some people have to work 3 jobs just to make rent. She shouldn't be complaining about her money. And like, I get that sentiment completely, but at the same time, she's not complaining that she can't like get by with the money that she's getting. She's complaining that she's being valued less than her male counterparts. And I think regardless of what the work is and how ridiculous you might think the pay is, men and women should always be paid equally, or like paid based on skill and performance and not gender. And so Bette Davis was often labelled difficult to work with, which when I read that, especially about a woman who's like historical, I always think, was she difficult to work with, or was she hard to control? You know, like, was she difficult to work with, or did she not let you get away with your shit? Did she stand up for herself and for her values and not get pushed around? So, I mean, who knows? I'll never know. I was never on set with her when she was working, but I think too often you'll find that like these kind of strong and outspoken and unapologetic women always happen to be labelled difficult to work with. And I guess it stings me a little bit because I can sometimes be a little bit like that. But I like to think that I'm not difficult to work with. I just stand my ground if I think I need to. So Bette Davis's acting career actually spanned 6 decades, which is super incredible. During her lifetime, she was also married 4 times, like Joan. 3 ended in divorce, and one of her marriages ended when her husband died, same as Joan. Davis had 3 children, her eldest daughter Bede, and 2 children who she adopted with her last husband, and they were called Michael and Margot. So again, we've got that similarity of adopting children as well, which I don't know if that was like more common back then, or if it is actually a weird coincidence that these 2 both adopted children. Either way, I think that's really cool. I definitely want to adopt a child someday. I just think there's so many perks to adopting. Adopt, don't shop. Now that we know a little bit about their histories, let's get into the feud. This feud is actually, considering how old it is, it's actually incredibly well documented, I thought, which I think shows that it's really stood the test of time. I personally didn't know too much about this feud before I started researching it, other than that it existed, but I didn't know like any of the details. However, I do love old Hollywood. I have a fascination with it. I love old Hollywood films. I love the old Hollywood actresses. I think the old Hollywood actors are like okay, but I think the actresses in particular, just I find them really gripping because they're so glamorous and striking, a lot of them. But I will say, I think because they are part of old Hollywood and they weren't alive and acting in my lifetime, sometimes they can seem a little bit one-dimensional. Or I guess what I mean by that is they can seem a little not human because, you know, every time we see Katharine Hepburn, it's her in these like beautifully poised photos or on screen wearing her like Chanel outfits. And same with like Marilyn Monroe, you know, like she's always looking so glamorous, and it's just, I think of that iconic photo of her in her like sparkly silver dress, the one that Kim ripped, R.I.P. But it's hard to tell or hard to picture them as like actual humans, you know, like try picturing Marilyn Monroe taking a shit or something. Like it's really hard to do. Whereas like I've got no problems picturing Florence Pugh taking a shit. I don't know. Sorry, that's really vulgar, but do you get my point? Like because we only see them in their polished form, they sometimes don't seem that human to me. Anyway, let me know if you agree with that or not, or if I'm just sounding crazy here. And so I actually really enjoyed researching this feud because I think feuds, you know, like it's people at their pettiest moments sometimes. It's like about conflict and drama, and that's where Joan Crawford and Bette Davis really seemed human to me. Bette and Joan are similar age, so they did often get compared similarly to how women of similar age often get compared in Hollywood today as well. I'm so sorry guys, I low-key just had a 30-minute break. You might have noticed that I do sound a little bit sick, so I actually just stopped and I made myself a little hot drink to try and just calm my throat down, and then I started scrolling on TikTok and now like 30 minutes has passed, so bear with while I get back into it. So, as I was saying, a lot of people kind of assume that Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were competing for the same roles all the time, and that's how their feud started. But as we know from their background deep dive that we did, Joan Crawford didn't start working for Warner Brothers, the studio where Bette Davis worked, until 1943. And so it's like, you know, like a decade after she made her start in Hollywood. So that kind of narrative isn't entirely true. So, where did this feud actually begin? Well, most sources say that it started in 1935 when Bette Davis was starring alongside Franchot Tone in the movie Dangerous. Now, if you recall, that's the one that Bette Davis ends up winning her first Oscar for. So, 1935, Bette Davis is starring alongside Franchot, and in a 1987 interview where Bette Davis was looking back on this time filming, she actually said, quote, "I fell in love with Franchot professionally and privately. Everything about him reflected his elegance, from his name to his manners." So Bette Davis had like a bit of a crush on Franchot, I guess you could say, and she was really taken by him. However, while they were actually still filming Dangerous, Franchot Tone and Joan Crawford announced their engagement. Now, at the time, Joan Crawford was the bigger actress, and Franchot Tone was absolutely stoked to be dating. You know, and we're in the 30s right now, and Joan Crawford was one of the top 10 money-making stars, so he was doing pretty well for himself, getting engaged to Joan. And so Joan Crawford would come on set every day and they'd have lunch together, and Bette Davis was not happy about this. In that same 1987 interview, she said, quote, "She took him from me. She did it coldly, deliberately, and with complete ruthlessness." And when I first started looking into this, I was like, is that a little bit harsh? Like, if you had a bit of a crush on a co-worker or someone you worked with, and then you found out that they were engaged, I don't know, wouldn't it just be more of like a, oh, bummer type situation rather than turning into this whole like, she took him from me, she did it coldly? I always thought that was really intense. And then I put my like conspiracy hat on and I was like, oh my god, unless Franchot was actually leading Bette Davis on while they were filming, and you know, maybe they actually made out or whatever you said back then, he courted her and then she found out about their engagement and now she's like Joan Crawford took from. This is all like completely alleged and just from my cuckoo side of my brain, but I just think it's like such a harsh reaction to have over your co-worker unless there was some kind of shared history or something going on behind the scenes. Anyway, Joan Crawford was questioned about this at some point as well, and she was quoted as saying, "Tone thought Bette was a good actress, but never thought of her as a woman," which is also a super scathing comment to make about someone, right? Like, what did he think of her as then? A prop? Or, I don't know. Oh my god, I thought that was just stone cold. So at the Oscars, when Bette Davis wins and goes up in her little costume navy dress, allegedly Francho Tone, obviously being her co-star, was super happy for her and embraced her, and Joan Crawford was just saying nothing. Like, she was just icing Bette Davis out, couldn't care less that she'd just won, and Francho actually says to Joan, like, "Oh, don't be rude, say, like, congratulate Bette." And so she allegedly turned to Bette and said, "Dear Bette, what a lovely frock," which of course is like super snaky because Bette Davis is wearing her little like costume dress that she deliberately wore to like piss off Jack Warner. Of course her dress isn't, I mean, I don't even think it looks that bad, but back then it was all about the glamour and the glitz, so you wouldn't be caught dead wearing the wrong kind of dress. I'd actually love to see someone like Joan Crawford reacting to what celebrities wear now. All the little dresses with their cutouts that look like they're from Supre. Anyway, that was unnecessarily mean. And so this whole little incident in 1935, this little like mini love triangle, definitely established a bit of cattiness between Bette and Joan. But from what I can tell from these quotes that I'm reading and their accounts of what happened, I'd say they're both on a pretty even playing field. There isn't one person who I think is very much the villain here and another person who's the victim. Like, I think both women can really stand their ground when it comes to feuding with one another. And we'll see that continue. Around this time as well, people start to spread gossip that Crawford might have had a bit of a crush on Bette Davis. I'm not sure how true that is. We'll probably never know. However, Joan Crawford was confirmed to be bisexual, which is really cool, especially for the early, 1900s. It would have been very rare for someone to... I don't think she was like necessarily like out the closet at the time, but later in life she did kind of say there wasn't like a term for it, but she always knew that she was attracted to men and women equally. That's kind of where the feud begins, and Bette Davis and Joan Crawford during interviews would often be asked about one another, and they'd have like little witty quips and stuff to say about one another, but there wasn't really anything further until 1943 when Joan Crawford moves to Warner Brothers. Now suddenly they are competing for roles, or at least they're being considered for the same roles. So I guess here you could say there's a little bit more tension. And by the 1950s, both women would have been labelled as past their prime. And this really does say a lot for the treatment of older women in Hollywood, because they would have been in their late 40s at this stage, so not old at all. But especially in old Hollywood, and I'm not saying by any means that the treatment of older women in Hollywood is great nowadays, but especially back then it was like really harsh for women to be playing roles, main character roles, once they kind of reached their like mid to late 40s. Often by the time women in old Hollywood were in their late 40s, early 50s, they would kind of be pigeonholed into either playing moms or grandmas, and they took on that kind of like more maternal character, but they never played any more the like complex characters or the main characters. Yeah, I'm talking about the general like classics in Hollywood. In fact, studios hated casting older women so much that if there was ever a character that was a little bit older, they would actually just cast younger actresses, and they would just age them with hair and makeup and costumes and things. Young actresses got to play the young roles, and young actresses also got to play the old roles. And I'd hate to say it, but we do still see some bad treatment we do still see this happening in Hollywood today, where an actress will reach a certain age and suddenly all the movies you see her, she is just playing like the mom or the grandma, and that's kind of like all there is to her personality. And that's why I always find it so incredible when we get actresses like Meryl Streep, for example, who really push those boundaries. Like, that woman could not be pigeonholed if you wanted to. I think she was in her 50s. Oh, nobody quote me if I'm wrong. But when she played Donna in Mamma Mia, and like, yeah, she's playing a mum in that, but she's also the main character. And like the story centers around her, and she's seen as like sexual and fun and flirty and energetic and complex, and not like her whole point isn't just that she's a mum. And then also in Devil Wears Prada, which I think she was in when she was like in her 50s maybe, or early 60s even. And like, again, Miranda Priestly is a super complex, interesting main character who isn't even a mum. And yeah, I think Meryl Streep definitely does a really good job of refusing to be aged out of Hollywood. So anyway, by the 1950s, both women are kind of struggling for parts a bit. They're struggling for money as well. Davis is struggling to get cast in any box office successes and losing out to the new up-and-coming young actresses, and Joan Crawford is left broke after Alfred Steele, the Pepsi man, dies in 1959. And so both women are kind of stuck, and they need to figure out how they can generate more income when all the Hollywood odds are stacked against them. So in the early 1960s, Joan stumbles upon the story of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Now, this story is about an elderly, differently abled former A-list movie star and a psychotic sister who torments her. And so right away when Joan reads the script, she's kind of thinking, now here's like a really cool role that's made for older women, but it's not about being pigeonholed into being a mom or a grandma. Like, this is, there's some depth here. There's something exciting. And of course, the main character, the differently abled former A-list movie star, has a nemesis being her psychotic sister. And so she thinks to herself, Bette Davis, who she's already feuding with, would be a great counterpart to this movie. So Joan actually visits Davis, who at the time is working on Broadway, and asks her to play opposite her. Joan was going to play Blanche, who's the elderly former A-list movie star, and Bette was going to play Jane, the psychotic sister. Bette actually agrees to take the role under the condition that the director, Robert Aldrich, was not sleeping with Joan, because she wanted to make sure that there was going to be no favoritism on set or any kind of carry on with only putting good lighting on Joan and bad lighting on her and things like that. And again, I think we see here an example of Bette Davis really knowing her worth, because if I was in her position and I was struggling for money and someone comes along and they're like, oh my God, do you want to be in this movie with me? I'd just be like, yeah. I wouldn't even think to be like, are you sleeping with the director? Are we both going to get equal and fair opportunities on the film set? So good for her. She's always keeping her wits about her. So at this time in Hollywood, there was this kind of stereotype of women in Hollywood who would try to remain relevant past their prime. And of course, like, past their prime, I'm putting into quote marks because these women are not old at this point by any means. But that's kind of the narrative once people kind of catch wind that Bette Davis and Joan Crawford are working on this movie together. Like, I don't think anyone really thought it was going to be a major success. People kind of were like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Look at these has-beens trying to still make it in Hollywood. And I think, again, we see just like a little bit of mistreatment of women, because I think about male actors and they're just not subject to that same expiration. Similar to today, like, we've got terms like silver fox to describe a man who's graying, and we don't really have like a female equivalent to that. I often find that men are sometimes celebrated for how they age, whereas women are kind of just shoved to the side. So while these two are filming their little movie, reports of pettiness start to trickle in. So it all starts apparently with Bette Davis installing a Coca-Cola machine in her dressing room, which of course is a direct stab at Joan, who was at the time on the board of directors for Pepsi. There's a scene where Bette Davis's character beats Joan Crawford's character. And Joan Crawford actually requested a body double because she was scared that Bette Davis would take this opportunity to hurt her in real life. There was a close-up shot where the director decided they couldn't use the body double because it would be too obvious. And Bette Davis smacked Joan in the head so hard that she apparently needed stitches. However, when Bette Davis was asked about this, she said she barely touched her. Which actually reminds me of how siblings fight. Like, you'll fully WWE body slam your sister, but then when she starts crying, you'll be like, what? I barely laid a finger on her. Anyway, Joan Crawford definitely got back at Bette Davis in a different scene where Bette Davis's character has to drag Joan Crawford's character out of bed.
Crawford apparently made herself super heavy. Some people say she stuffed rocks in her pockets. Other people say she was wearing like a heavyweight belt underneath her outfit and then would purposely ruin takes so that Davis had to basically just repeatedly schlep her out of the bed in her like with her extreme weight. And Bette Davis at the time also has a bad back, so this was again just like super petty, trying to make it hard for Bette Davis, as hard for Bette Davis as possible. I think it's interesting to note that these stories are all coming out from like other cast members and crew who are working on set and just like Hollywood gossip, right? But when Bette and Joan were actually asked about this alleged feud whilst they were filming, they both maintained that they were not feuding at all and that they were actually getting along fine. And so I think there could be one of two things going on here. Either there really was no feuding and this is all just pushed, this whole narrative was just pushed by the industry to kind of garner press, or Bette and Joan just were lying. I think it is interesting to consider that the industry was fueling this because it's similar to what we see with like PR relationships today, right? Like a movie will come out and then suddenly the two main actors will be like paparazzi kissing in a car or something. And then people want to go see the movie more because they want to try figure out if they can see like real chemistry whilst the people are acting. And I guess it's a similar situation here where Bette and Joan had that historic feud from 1935. And now that they're making this movie together, maybe the industry was kind of trying to push the narrative like, oh my God, these two were absolutely fighting it out on set and you'll just have to come see the movie to see that like real life hatred portrayed on screen. And again, we have to remember that while they were filming it, nobody thought this movie was going to be good. Like no one thought it would do well. Everyone thought it would do terribly because the two main characters are these like outdated Hollywood actresses. So it does make sense that the industry would kind of like push this narrative to garner press and generate some kind of hype around it. In 1963, it's the Oscars and the film is a total success, propelling the careers of both women, which like I feel like I can't mention this enough. This was a huge achievement for these two because they kind of showed Hollywood that there were roles for women of their age and that films that cast older women could be successful. They sparked a new genre of horror movies deemed hagsploitation, which is a portmanteau of hags, which is, obviously a word for old women typically, and exploitation. It's like exploiting old women to make horror movies. And this hagsploitation actually inspired a lot of cheap remakes where studios would basically just take the exact same concept and were trying to just reproduce it over and over again after seeing how successful whatever happened to Baby Jane was. Now here's where things get a little bit ugly because Bette Davis receives a nomination for her role as the like psychotic sister and Joan Crawford receives absolutely nothing. No nominations. She's completely snubbed. And we have to remember, it was her idea to make this movie in the first place. Like she read the script, she saw the potential, she cast herself and Bette Davis, and yet she got no credit for it. But Joan Crawford is a woman who never quits, and so rather than sitting around and sulking about it, she thought of alternative ways to still have her moment at the 1963 Oscars. She actually ended up approaching all the other women who were nominated in Bette Davis's category. We're talking of the likes of Katharine Hepburn, Lee Remick, Geraldine Page, and Anne Bancroft. And she calls these ladies up and offers to accept their Oscars on their behalf if they win and if they can't attend the Oscars. And these actresses all happen to be East Coast based. And of course the Oscars are in the West Coast and, travel wouldn't have been as easy as it was today. And it might not have actually been worth the energy and time for these women to travel to the Oscars all the way across the United States and then not win. So they actually all agreed. So suddenly the odds go from Joan Crawford receiving no nominations to pretty much if anyone wins Best Actress aside from Bette Davis, Joan Crawford gets to go up on stage. I think this is super smart and this is actually a pretty boss move. Anyway, skip forward to Oscar night and Bancroft actually wins for her role. And of course, as organised, Joan Crawford goes up on stage to accept the Oscar on her behalf. She apparently just completely strutted past Bette Davis, feeling herself. She was photographed holding the Oscar with all the other winners because you know, like she accepted the award on their behalf, so she gets to be in all the photo ops, and the night actually ends up being more about her than about Bette. And now Bette was absolutely furious about this, and she maintained for the rest of her life that Crawford actually campaigned against her and was the reason that she didn't win. Crawford, of course, completely denies this, but in that 1987 interview with Bette Davis that I mentioned earlier, she said she was so angry about this because the film could have actually been way more successful if she'd gotten the Oscar. And in her mind, you know, Joan Crawford kind of sabotaged everything and in the process, like, won the battle but lost the war. And the movie could have been like 10 times bigger if she'd been an Oscar winner. I think another reason why Bette Davis is so angry about this is because if she'd won that night, she would have actually been the first person to win 3 Oscars. And she was quoted as saying, "As an Aries, I always have to be first. I should have had it that year, no question." So in her mind, truly, Joan Crawford is the sole reason why she, 1, didn't win the Oscar that night, and 2, didn't become the first person to win 3 Oscars. But also, interesting, she knows that as an Aries, she is like super competitive and fiery. I love that. We love a self-aware queen. Following the success of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, of course, Crawford and Davis set out to star together in another film. However, after only a week and a half of filming, Joan Crawford actually goes missing, and the directors and everyone like hired private investigators to hunt her down, and then when they found her eventually, she said that she didn't want to make the movie anymore and she was out. Some people rumor that they started filming and Joan Crawford got like intimidated by Bette Davis and decided that she didn't want to be outstaged again and so would rather not continue with the project, but it's unclear how true that is. So Joan Crawford unfortunately died from a heart attack in 1977, and Bette Davis was quoted as saying, "You should never say bad things about the dead. You should only say good. Joan Crawford is dead. Good." Which is a pretty killer quote about your nemesis, and I'll probably be quoted saying the exact same when my nemesis dies. Of course, it's unclear how true this is. It was apparently someone like had told her that Joan Crawford had died, and then she came back with that like super witty quote. But yeah, we'll never really know how true that is. So that is kind of everything that I managed to find out about their feud. What do you think? Did these women actually hate each other? Was the feud kind of exaggerated a bit by the media to generate PR for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? Or was the feud exaggerated to kind of pit these powerful women against each other? Because as we know, Hollywood loves to pit powerful women against each other. Is there an alternate universe where these two could have actually been friends? I think so. I absolutely think, I like wholeheartedly believe that. They've got so much in common, and in a way they were probably the only people who understood what the other person was going through. They both worked in the same cutthroat industry. They both kind of worked their way up to get into that industry. They both had like really big pits and really big peaks in their career, had several marriages, both adopted children, and I didn't have too much time to go into this, but both of their eldest daughters actually ended up writing really scathing biographies about them, alleging neglect and child abuse whilst growing up. So Bette Davis's daughter BD wrote a memoir called My Mother's Keeper, and Joan Crawford's eldest daughter Christina wrote the memoir Mummy Dearest. And yeah, the accounts in there are pretty scathing, but again, it's unclear how true that is, and there are actually sources who are close to both Bette and Joan who deny the allegations that are made in those books, and people kind of accused Christina and Bette of just being like money hungry and looking for a quick cash grab. But let me know if you'd like to know more about that. I could potentially do like a little follow-up mini episode about their biographies and the abuse that they allege and how true or untrue this potentially is. Anyway, I just find that really interesting that they both had eldest daughters who ended up doing that. So yeah, I think these two could have probably been friends, but they were both Aries, so that was never going to happen. Anyway, that is all that I have on this episode. Let me know if you liked it or not. Sorry that my voice is a little bit sick and croaky today. I hope you all have a great week, and definitely make sure you tune in next week. Thank you so much for listening. Leave me a rating and a review, give me some constructive feedback. I love constructive criticism. I'm a Capricorn, so I always want to strive to be better. And yeah, follow the Instagram at Mood for Feud. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye.